James Burnham was born in Chicago in 1905. He attended Princeton University, where he graduated at the top of his class before attending Oxford University in England, where J.R.R. Tolkien was one of his professors. Returning to America, he became both a professor of philosophy at New York University and heavily involved in the American Communist movement. Burnham later rejected the communist philosophy of dialectical materialism, and in 1941 he published The Managerial Revolution, arguing that socialism was not about to replace capitalism, but that another economic system, managerialism, was already in the process of replacing capitalism throughout the world, bringing a new type of ruling class with it. If the central argument of the Managerial Revolution is that the managers will constitute the new ruling class of the future, it is important to define what we mean by ruling class. A ruling class does not presuppose any particular kind of government or any particular legal form of property right. It rests upon the fact of control of access to the means of production and the preferential distribution of the wealth created, and can be investigated empirically. It may also be observed that the two chief factors in control of access and preferential treatment in distribution, are closely related in practice. Over any period of time, those who control access, not unnaturally, grant themselves preferential treatment in distribution, and contending groups trying to alter the relations of distribution could accomplish this only by getting control of access. In fact, since differences in distribution or income are much easier to study than relations of control, those differences are usually the plainest evidence we have for discovering the relations of control. Put more simply, the easiest way to discover what the ruling group is in any society is usually to see what group gets the biggest incomes. We have defined ruling class as consisting of the group of persons which has, as a matter of fact, not necessarily of law or words or theory, as against the rest of the population, a special degree of control over access to the instruments of production and preferential treatment in the distribution of the products of those instruments. In many societies, the members of the ruling class in question have also, in their own persons, administered the state, that is, have been the governing officials in the state apparatus. In feudal society, for example, this was usually the case. But it has not always been the case. In some societies, the state has been administered, its chief offices have been occupied by persons who were not themselves members of the ruling class, or rather, who were distinctly subordinate to members of the ruling class. This has been the situation most of the time in capitalist society. As we have defined ruling class, there is no doubt at all that usually the chief members of the ruling class were not to be found in high governmental office. In capitalist society, the chief members of the ruling class were the great industrialists and financiers. All organised societies are cemented together not merely by force and the threat of force, and by established patterns of institutional behaviour, but also by accepted ways of feeling and thinking and talking and looking at the world, by ideologies. No one today will deny the crucial social function of ideologies, though we are always more critical about others' ideologies than about our own. Indeed, many of us like to feel ourselves free from the influence of any ideology, though we are seldom prepared to grant such enlightenment to anyone else. A society cannot hold together unless there is a fairly general acceptance on the part of most of its members, not necessarily of the same ideology, but, at any rate, of ideologies which develop out of similar root concepts as starting points. So ideologies capable of influencing and winning the acceptance of great masses of people are an indispensable verbal cement holding the fabric of any given type of society together. But analysis of ideologies, in terms of their practical effects, shows us that they ordinarily work to serve and advance the interests of some particular social group or class, and we may therefore speak of a given ideology as being that of the group or class in question. However, it is even more important to observe that no major ideology is content to profess openly that it speaks only for the group whose interests it in fact expresses. Each group insists that its ideology is universal in validity and expresses the interests of humanity as a whole, and each group tries to win universal acceptance for its ideology. An ideology does not gain great attractive power merely because of the words that are in it or the skill of those who propagate it. These factors cannot be disregarded, but an ideology is not able to make a widespread way among the masses unless, in however distorted and deceptive a manner, it expresses actual needs and interests and hopes of the masses, and corresponds, at least in some measure, with the actual state of social conditions and possible directions of their development. The ideologies expressing the social role and interests and aspirations of the managers have not yet been fully worked out, any more than were the bourgeois' ideologies in the period of transition from feudalism to capitalism. They are already approximated, however, from several different but similar directions, by, for example, Leninism-Stalinism, mid-20th century Germanism, and, at a more primitive level, by New Dealism and such less influential American ideologies as technocracy. There are many millions of persons and many groups in the world today who consciously advocate state ownership of the instruments of production. They do so out of a variety of motives. Some because they think it will bring about a classless society and freedom, others because they think it will make possible universal material well-being, and others from even more abstractly moral reasons. The attitude and actions of these persons and groups are one of the most important social forces tending to bring about state ownership. Nevertheless, the result of state ownership does not depend upon the motives from which these people advocate it. Under the given historical circumstances, the result will not be classlessness and freedom, not even universal material well-being, but a new form of exploiting class society, managerial society. The primary function of ideologies, whether moral or religious or metaphysical or social, is to express human interests, needs, desires, hopes, and fears, not to cover the facts. A dispute about scientific theories can always be settled, sooner or later, by experiment and observation. A dispute between rival ideologies can never be thus settled. Arguments about ideologies can, and do, continue as long as the interests embodied by them are felt to be of any significance. The major ideologies of a class society must be able to perform two tasks. They must actually express, at least roughly, the social interests of the ruling class in question, and must aid in creating a pattern of thought and feeling favourable to the maintenance of the key institutions and relations of the given social structure. They must at the same time be so expressed as to be capable of appealing to the sentiments of the masses. An ideology embodying the interests of a given ruling class would not be the slightest use as a social cement if it openly expressed its function of keeping the ruling class in power over the rest of society. The ideology must ostensibly speak in the name of humanity, the people, the race, the future, God, destiny, and so on. Furthermore, in spite of the opinion of many present-day cynics, not just any ideology, is capable of appealing to the masses. It is more than a problem of skillful propaganda technique. A successful ideology has got to seem to the masses, in however confused a way, to actually express some of their own interests. In a period of social transition, the ideologies of the old society are under attack by the rising ideologies of the society to be, just as the institutions of the old society and the economic and political power of the old ruling class are under attack. The rising ideologies naturally devote much of their attention to the negative task of undermining mass acceptance of the old ideologies. Many dialectical and philosophical variations are possible, just as there were many variant developments of the capitalist concepts. There will be no the managerial ideology any more than there was the capitalist ideology. The several managerial ideologies will, however, revolve around a common axis, as the capitalist ideologies revolved around a common and different axis. Cultural background, local history, religion, the path taken by the revolution, the ingenuity of individual propagandists will permit a considerable diversity in the new ideologies, just as they have in those of past societies. That an ideology should be a managerial ideology, it is not necessary that managers should be its inventors or the first to adopt it. Capitalists did not invent capitalist ideologies, and intellectuals were elaborating them when the ambition of nearly every capitalist was still to be a feudal lord. If we are to understand the transition of capitalist society into managerial society, we must first understand how feudal society became capitalist. In feudal society, by far the major instrument of production was the land. Feudal economy was overwhelmingly agricultural. De facto control of the land, with important restrictions, and preferential treatment in the distribution of its products were in the hands of the feudal lords, including the lords of the church. Not, of course, as capitalist landlords, but through the peculiar institutions of feudal property rights. These lords therefore constituted the ruling class in feudal society. So long as agriculture remained the chief sector of the economy, and so long as society upheld the feudal property rights, the lords remained the ruling class. It is certainly not the case that the capitalists of the world at some point got together, held a series of meetings, and came to the decision that they would embark upon a struggle for power against the feudal lords in order to organise society in such a manner as to be most beneficial to themselves. Then went out and did battle against the assembled feudal lords, defeated them, and took over in person control of all the key institutions of society. Two factors were of decisive importance in transforming society to a bourgeois structure. A great deal of fighting and wars to break the physical power of the feudal lords, and the propagation on a mass scale of new ideologies suited to break the moral power of feudalism and to establish social attitudes favourable to the bourgeois structure of society. Now, the capitalists did not, in any considerable measure, do the actual fighting in the wars, nor themselves elaborate the new ideologies. But the capitalists financed those who did the fighting and the thinking. The actual fighting was done in the early centuries for the most part by armies of mercenary soldiers, who, after the introduction of gunpowder, were more than a match for the feudal knights and their retainers, and later on, especially in the great revolutions, by the non-bourgeois masses, workers and poor peasants. The ideologies were for the most part worked out by intellectuals, writers and political theorists and philosophers, and by lawyers. The capitalists, starting from the small medieval towns and trading centres where primitive capitalist relations were already present at the height of the Middle Ages, gradually extended their dominance by reducing a greater and greater percentage of the widening economy to their control. that is, by bringing an ever greater percentage of trade and production within the structure of the capitalist form of economic relations, by making an ever greater percentage of the instruments of production the property of capitalists. This process continued, an almost unbroken expansion, until the First World War. It must be stressed that the building of bourgeois dominance began and was carried far within feudalism, while the structure of society was predominantly feudal in character, while, in particular, the political, religious, and educational institutions were still controlled in the primary interests of the feudal lords. This was possible because society accorded the capitalists, at least to a sufficient extent, those rights necessary for carrying on capitalist enterprise, of contract, of taking interest, hiring free workers for wages, etc., in spite of the fact that most of these rights were directly forbidden by feudal law, custom, and philosophy. Often, as in the case of taking interest, pious formulas were used to get around the prohibitions. And in spite of the fact that the wide extension of capitalist relations meant necessarily the destruction of the social dominance of the feudal lords. By the time the feudal lords, or some of them, woke up to what was happening, and the threat to themselves, and tried to fight back, the battle was already just about over, for the bourgeois already controlled effectively the key bastions of society. If feudal society had refused from the beginning to recognize the bourgeois rights, the outcome might have been very different. But this is useless speculation, since, in practice and in fact, these rights were sufficiently recognized. The fact that the bourgeois did build up their social dominance, did reduce ever-widening sectors of the economy to their control, within the still persisting framework of feudal society was, it would seem, a necessary condition for their appearing as the ruling class of the succeeding type of society. This point, in reverse, can reveal to us a decisive but neglected reason why socialism is not going to come about. We have granted that, if socialism were going to come, the proletariat would have to be the social class chiefly concerned with its arrival. But the position of the proletariat in capitalist society is not at all the same as that of the bourgeois in late feudal society. The proletariat does not have a long period to build up gradually its social dominance, which means, above all, to extend control over greater and greater percentages of the instruments of production, a control expressed usually in the language of property rights. On the contrary, it does not have any such control, nor can it have in bourgeois society, or virtually none. As a matter of fact, the transformation of the state institutions into integral parts of a capitalist society was a lengthy and complicated process, sometimes, but not always, including bitter civil war as decisive steps. In the 15th and 16th, and even the 17th centuries, the early capitalists, we know from the records of those times, worked closely with princes and kings. The king in feudal society had been relatively unimportant, one feudal lord among others, often with less actual power than his chief vassals. When the kings began to strengthen their central authority and tried to build nations in the modern sense, their most obvious enemies were the feudal lords, including feudal lords who were supposed to be their own vassals. The kings sought support from the capitalists. The capitalists gave support to the kings because they too wanted stronger nations with national armies and navies to protect trade routes, and uniform laws, currencies, and taxes, so that trade could be carried out without constant interruption from 100 feudal barons who considered themselves independent lords. Because they made huge sums of money from dealing with the princes, and because they exacted protection and privileges in return for the aid they gave. In the wars and peace treaties, the elections of popes or emperors, the voyages of explorers and conquering armies during the 16th century, we always find a most prominent part played by one of the great merchant bankers of Augsburg or Antwerp or Lyon or Genoa. But the princes too could not be trusted in business matters. As many of these same great 16th century capitalists found to their bankruptcy and ruin, the de facto alliance between prince and capitalist was dissolved, and the prince was ousted, made a figurehead, or at least restricted in the area over which his power extended. There were more wars and revolutions, and the ideal bourgeois state of the late 18th and 19th centuries emerged. Political power vested in the lower house of a parliament, with full assurance that parliament was, by constitution, law, habit, custom, and belief, dedicated to the upholding of the structure of rights and obligations in terms of which society is organized as capitalist. One last observation in connection with the struggle for power of the bourgeois. Where did the early capitalists come from? They came from several sections of society. Adventurers and brigands turned easily into capitalists after success in some escapade. Artisans or master craftsmen became capitalists when they began to hire workers for wages. The biggest capitalists of the early period came from the ranks of the merchant shippers, who were a special group even in the Middle Ages proper. The point I wish to note is that in some, not a few, cases, the capitalists came from the ranks of the old ruling class, from among the feudal lords themselves. Many of the feudal lords were killed off in the various wars, the family lines of many others died out or sank into impoverished obscurity. But some of them turned themselves into capitalists, by driving the serfs off their land and engaging in agriculture as capitalist landlords. By undertaking the capitalist exploitation of mines on their land, or by using for capitalist ventures gold or jewels or money that they had acquired. We must remember, for the future also, that for a ruling class to be eliminated from society in favour of another ruling class does not mean that all of its individual members and families disappear. Some of them may be found, perhaps prominently found, economically and socially metamorphosized into the ranks of the new ruling class. So we are now in a position to elaborate broadly the changes we should expect to see if society is in fact transforming from a capitalist to a managerial society. There takes place a drastic change in the most important social, economic and political institutions. The system of property relations, the forms under which economic production is carried on, the legal structure, the type of political organisation and regime are all so sharply altered that we feel compelled to call them different in kind, not merely modified in degree. Feudal property relations, modes of economic production, law, political organisation are all replaced by modern bourgeois property relations, modes of production, law and political organisation. During the course of the revolution, it often happens that the old institutions are quite literally smashed to pieces, with new institutions developing to perform analogous functions in the new society. Along with the changes in social institutions, there go more or less parallel changes in cultural institutions and in the dominant beliefs which men hold about man's place in the world and the universe. This cultural shift is plainly seen in the transition from feudal to modern capitalist society, both in the reorganisation of the form and place of such institutions as the church and the schools, and in the complete alteration of the general view of the world, of life and of man which took place during the Renaissance. Finally, we observe a change in the group of men which holds the top positions, which controls the greater part of power and privilege in society. To the social dominance of feudal lords, with their vassals and fiefs, succeeds the social dominance of industrialists and bankers with their monetary wealth, their factories, and wage workers. In this conception, there is a certain arbitrariness. The fact is that social and cultural institutions, beliefs, and relationships of social power always change, are subject to a continuous modification. It is impossible to draw an exact temporal line dividing one type of society from another. What is important is not so much the fact of change, which is always present in history, as the rate of change. Capitalist economy is a system of private ownership, of ownership of a certain type, vested in private individuals, of private enterprise. The capitalist state is therefore, and necessarily, a limited state, with sovereignty usually embodied in a parliament. In earlier capitalist times, the function of technical management was not crucial. The process of production was so simple, the division of labour so little developed compared to today, that hardly any special skill or training were necessary to carry out the functions of management. Nearly anyone who had any reasonable acquaintance with the industry in question could handle the job. In the early days of capitalism, the typical capitalist, the ideal of the ideologists before and after Adam Smith, was himself his own manager, so far as there were managerial functions other than those assigned to some reliable skilled worker in the shop. He was the individual entrepreneur who owned the whole or the greater share of a factory or mine or shop or steamship company or whatever it might be, and actively managed his own enterprise, perhaps to retire in old age in favour of management by his heirs. But, as is well known, the growth of large-scale public corporations, along with the technological development of modern industry, have virtually wiped such types of enterprise out of the important sections of the economy. With a few exceptions, they remain only among the small businesses, which are trivial in their historical influence. These changes have meant that to an ever-growing extent, the managers are no longer, either as individuals or legally or historically, the same as the capitalists. There is a combined shift. Through changes in the technique of production, the functions of management become more distinctive, more complex, more specialized, and more crucial to the whole process of production, thus serving to set those who perform these functions off as a separate group or class in society, and at the same time those who formerly carried out what functions there were of management, the bourgeoisie, themselves withdraw from management, so that the difference in function becomes also a difference in the individuals who carry out the function. It would seem obvious that in capitalist society it would be the capitalists who, in decisive respects at least, do the managing. If they do not manage the instruments of production, how could they maintain their position as ruling class, which depends upon control over the instruments of production? The answer to this question is that they could not. It is the fact that during the past several decades, the de facto management of the instruments of production has to a constantly increasing extent got out of the hands of the capitalists that so plainly proves society to be shifting away from capitalism, and the capitalists are losing their status as the ruling class. In ever-widening sections of the world economy, the actual managers are not the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, or, at the very least, the managerial prerogatives of the capitalists are being progressively whittled down. The completion of this process means the elimination of the capitalists from control over the economy, and their disappearance as a ruling class. In the simplest terms, the theory of the Managerial Revolution asserts merely the following. Modern society has been organised through a certain set of major economic, social and political institutions which we call capitalist, and has exhibited certain major social beliefs or ideologies. Within this social structure, we find that a particular group or class of persons, the capitalist or bourgeoisie, is the dominant or ruling class in the sense which has been defined, At the present time, these institutions and beliefs are undergoing a process of rapid transformation. The conclusion of this period of transformation, to be expected in the comparatively near future, will find society organised through a quite different set of major economic, social and political institutions, and exhibiting quite different major social beliefs or ideologies. Within the new social structure, a different social group or class, the managers, will be the dominant or ruling class. We are now in a position to state in a preliminary way the theory of the Managerial Revolution. The theory holds, to begin with, that we are now in a period of social transition, a period characterized, that is, by an unusually rapid rate of change of the most important economic, social, political, and cultural institutions of society. This transition is from the type of society which we have called capitalist or bourgeois to a type of society which we shall call managerial. If, in managerial society, no individuals are to hold comparable property rights, how can any group of individuals constitute a ruling class? The answer is comparatively simple and, as already noted, not without historical analogies. The managers will exercise their control over the instruments of production and gain preference in the distribution of the products, not directly through property rights vested in them as individuals, but indirectly through their control of the state, which in turn will own and control the instruments of production. The state, that is, the institutions which comprise the state, will, if we wish to put it that way, be the property of the managers, and that will be quite enough to place them in the position of ruling class. The control of the state by the managers will be suitably guaranteed by appropriate political institutions analogous to the guarantee of bourgeois dominance under capitalism by the bourgeois political institutions. But we must remember that the language of the struggle for power is metaphorical. No more than in the case of the capitalists have the managers or their representatives ever got together to decide, deliberately and explicitly, that they were going to make a bid for world power. Nor will the bulk of those who have done and will do the fighting in the struggle be recruited from the ranks of the managers themselves. Most of the fighters will be the workers and youths who will, doubtless many of them believe, that they are fighting for ends of their own. Nor have the managers themselves been constructing and propagating their own ideologies. This has been, and is being, done for the most part by intellectuals, writers, philosophers. Most of these intellectuals are not in the least aware that the net social effect of the ideologies which they elaborate contribute to the power and privilege of the managers and to the building of a new structure of class rule in society. As in the past, the intellectuals believe that they are speaking in the name of truth and for the interests of all humanity. The gap in amount of skill and training and in difference of type of function between the average worker and those who are in charge on the technical side of the process of production is far greater today than in the past. From among those tasks which today require lengthy training and considerable skill, 3 may be separated out. One type is found widely in those industries which, like the building industry, have not yet been organized in accordance with modern methods. There is, however, no technical reason why this has not been done. If it were done, the relative number of highly skilled workers in, for example, building would at once enormously decrease. Another type consists of those tasks which need elaborate training in the physical sciences and in engineering. These have greatly increased in recent decades. A century ago, there were scarcely any highly trained chemists, physicists, biochemists, or even engineers functioning directly in industry. The comparatively primitive techniques of those days did not require such persons. Today, few branches of industry could operate without their constant services. The third type consists of the tasks of the technical direction and coordination of the process of production. All the necessary workers, skilled and unskilled, and all the industrial scientists will not turn out automobiles by themselves. The diverse tasks must be organised, coordinated, so that the different materials, tools, machines, plants, workers are all available at the proper place and moment and in the proper numbers. This task of direction and coordination is itself a highly specialised function. Often, it also requires acquaintance with the physical sciences and with engineering. But it is a mistake to confuse this directing and coordinating function with the scientific and engineering work which has been listed under the second type. After all, the engineers and scientists of the second type are merely highly skilled workers, no different in kind from the worker whose developed skill enables him to make a precision tool or operate an ingenious lathe. They have no functions of guiding, administering, managing, or organising the process of production. These tasks are the distinctive mark of the third type. For these tasks, engineering and scientific knowledge may be, though it is not always or necessarily, a qualification, but the tasks themselves are not engineering or science in the usual sense. It is this third type of function which, in the fullest and clearest meaning, I call managing, and those who carry out this type of function are they whom I call the managers. Many different names are given to them. We may often recognise them as production managers, operating executives, superintendents, administrative engineers, supervisory technicians, or, in government, as administrators, commissioners, bureau heads, and so on. I mean by managers, in short, those who already, for the most part, in contemporary society are actually managing, on its technical side, the actual process of production, no matter what the legal and financial form of the process, whether individual, corporate, or governmental. There will be a hierarchy among the managers. In our current capitalist society, there is a fourfold separation into managers, executives, finance capitalists, and stockholders, which is, in reality, a separation of junction, the four types of relation in which it is possible to stand towards a certain section of the instruments of production. It is theoretically possible, therefore, that one and the same individual, or one and the same groups of individual, should perform all four of these functions, should stand in all four of these relations to the instruments of production in question, for example, the tangible assets of an automobile company. That is, one and the same individual, or groups of individuals, could manage the production of the company, direct its policy so as to make a profit, integrate its activities in relation to banks and to other companies, and be the sole stockholder of the company. Not only is such an identity possible, until comparatively recently, it was normally the case. Today, however, it is very seldom the case, especially in the most important sections of industry. The four functions are much more sharply differentiated than in the past, and they are, as a rule, performed by different sets of persons. It is not always so, of course, but it tends to become more and more so. The position, role, and function of the managers are in no way dependent upon the maintenance of capitalist property relations, even if many of the managers themselves think so. They depend upon the technical nature of the process of modern production. Consequently, the preservation of the capitalist relations is not an absolute decisive question for the managers. The position, role, and function of the most privileged of all the groups, the finance capitalists, are, however, entirely bound up with the capitalist property and economic relations, and their preservation is decisive for even the continued existence of this group. A potential source of conflict is found in what we might call occupational bias. The different things which these different groups do promote in their respective members different attitudes, habits of thought, ideals, and ways and methods of solving problems. To put it crudely, the managers tend to think of solving social and political problems as they coordinate and organise the actual process of production. The non-managerial executives think of society as a price-governed, profit-making animal. The finance capitalists think of problems in terms of what happens in banks and stock exchanges and security flotations. And the little stockholders think of the economy as a mysterious god who, if placated properly, will hand out free gifts to the deserving. Let us consider the position in which the managers, and those who from ability and ambition and actual or potential training would like to be managers, find themselves during the last decade in capitalist nations. And let us consider also how they themselves see their own position in the world. From their point of view, they are the ones who are actually running modern society, making it work, providing its brains, keeping it going. Nevertheless, they do not get rewards in terms either of unchallenged power or of percentage of the national income, commensurate with what they feel to be their functional role. In particular, the capitalists, even though they may never come near a factory or a mine, get far more. The managers' training as administrators of modern production naturally tends to make them think in terms of coordination, integration, efficiency, planning, and to extend such terms from the area of production under their immediate direction to the economic process as a whole. When the managers think about it, the old-line capitalists, sunning themselves in Miami and Hawaii or dabbling in finance, appear to them as parasites, having no justifiable function in society and at the same time preventing the managers from introducing the methods and efficiency which they would like. The masses also are, through the trade union and other devices introduced under capitalism, interfering with the managers' control and plans. Besides, the masses seem to the managers stupid, incapable of running things, of real leadership. The managers know that with the technological means at their disposal, it would be perfectly easy for them to put everyone to work, but the existing setup prevents them from acting. They naturally tend to identify the welfare of mankind as a whole with their own interests, and the salvation of mankind with their assuming control of society. Society can be run, they think, in more or less the same way that they know they, when they are allowed, can run efficiently and productively a mass production factory.
Here is a record of it to judge for yourself. City streets, pounded by ever-increasing traffic, are modernized, resurfaced, thousands of blocks which mean huge savings in local tax money. Vital to the communities which they serve are the thousands of miles of highways, constructed and improved by the Works program. The need for first-class highways grows constantly as the automobile and the motor truck become increasingly important in both city and rural commerce.
What must be stressed is how large the area of government enterprise already is, even in the United States. It doesn't make any difference if we call WPA and CCC relief, or biological and agricultural and meteorological surveys research, or food stamp plans distribution of surplus, or ash and garbage removal as municipal services. They are all, in the contemporary world, part of the total economic process. For that matter, education may also be treated as an economic institution, and is, except for a negligible fraction, a government enterprise. And government, either directly or through subsidy, provides about half the medical care in the United States. The immediate bureaucracy of the federal government includes over 1 million persons, double the number of a decade ago. but if we include the employees of state, county and municipal governments, the army, navy, courts, prisons, the recipients of all types of relief, we find that already in the United States, half or more of the entire population is dependent wholly or in determining part upon the government for the means of living. The historically anti-capitalist nature of the extension of governmental ownership and control is the only basis from which we can plausibly explain the attitude of the capitalists themselves. Communists are forced to the most complex and devious psychological fairy tales to get around these difficulties. When the capitalists, almost en masse, object, say, to some New Deal extension of the government into the economy, the communists are compelled to say that the capitalists, with their complaints, are only trying to deceive the people or are deceiving themselves about their own best interests. Such explanations are logically possible, but most unlikely, especially when there is a far simpler one that fits the facts directly. The capitalists object because the measures are against their interests. The capitalists, for a long time, are able to make up for each separate loss, even often to seem to gain after it, but they do so only by exhausting their own resources. They operate further and further from shore, but meanwhile their own base is progressively narrowed. It is like a poker player with a great pile of chips, covering and raising each bet from his opponent. The opponent, meanwhile, is getting his chips by sneaking them from the bottom of our player's pile. When the pile is big, the game can go on for a long time, but in the end, there is no doubt about the victor. In the United States, sovereignty may still chiefly be located in Congress, together with the Supreme Court. It may still be the principal law-making body, but no one with eyes open during the past generation, and especially the past decade, will believe that its claims are today undisputed. Laws today in the United States, in fact most laws, are not being made any longer by Congress, but by the NLRB, SEC, ICC, AAA, TVA, FTC, FCC, the Office of Production Management, and the other leading executive agencies. How well lawyers know this to be the case. To keep up with contemporary law, it is the rulings and records of these agencies that they chiefly have to study. How plainly it is reflected in the enormous growth of the executive branch of the government, which is no longer simply executive, but legislative and judicial as well, in comparison with that of the other two branches. Indeed, most of the important laws passed by Congress in recent years have been laws to give up some more of its sovereign power to one or another agency, largely outside of its control. It is clearly to the advantage of the managers that the localization of sovereignty should be shifted to the administrative bureaus. These institutions are of a sort with which the managers can most easily collaborate. In fact, these bureaus have, in their leading staff, got to be peopled primarily by managers. It is a managerial function that they are performing. Thus, the social rule of the managers as a class can be best assured when the sovereignty is recognized as pertaining de facto and to a considerable extent de jure as well to the bureaus. The social position of the managers is buttressed in the bureaus both against the claims of the capitalists and also against the pressure of the masses, as neither group can function effectively through the bureaus. We must not anticipate a process which is not finished. The big bourgeoisie, the finance capitalists, are still the ruling class in the United States. The final control is still in their hands. But we must not view the world too narrowly nor limit our eyes to the surface. For it is a world process with which we are dealing, since capitalism is a world system. The United States is linked economically, socially, culturally, and most dramatically of all, strategically, with all the world. And the process goes all the way to the roots of society. It does not remain merely on the outer layers. If we lift our eyes to the world arena and sink them to the roots, we will see what is there, that the capitalists, the ruling class of modern society, are losing control, that the social structure which placed them in the position of ruling class is being transformed, not tomorrow, but now, as we watch, and in the new structure, when its foundations are completed, there will be no capitalists. In managerial society, politics and economics are directly interfused. The state does not recognize its capitalist limits. The economic arena is also the arena of the state. Consequently, there is no sharp separation between political officials and captains of industry. The captain of industry is, by virtue of his function, at the same time a state official. The Supreme Planning Commission is indistinguishably a political and an economic institution. In capitalist society, the capitalist controlled the state indirectly, in the sense that the state backed up, when necessary, the capitalist rule over the economy, and kept in force the capitalist economic, social, and legal relations. In managerial society, the managers become the state. To say that the ruling class is the managers is almost the same thing as to say that it is the state bureaucracy. The two have, by and large, coalesced. There is not a trace of a magic in the structure of state ownership which could, in some mysterious and necessary way, eliminate class rule and domination. On the contrary, and this is not a question of speculation but already shown by historical experience, an economy of state ownership can provide the basis for domination and exploitation by a ruling class of an extremity and absoluteness never before known. Today, the managers are carrying on a triple battle against the capitalists, whose interests are bound up with the decaying social order, against the masses, who, obscurely, are a social force tending against oppression and class rule of any kind, and against each other for the first prizes in the new world. The hold of the capitalists on the instruments of production must be smashed. The masses must be curbed, and as many as possible of them diverted so that their weight is thrown onto the side of the managers and of the new social structure. The various sections of the managers contend with each other on a world scale for mastery. This is a complex process, with its elements so intertwined that it is often hard to see through to the major forces. But comparable processes in history indicate that it is worked out by wars and revolutions and persecutions and terror, and by the clash also of rival propaganda and ideologies, all under a bewildering variety of slogans and ostensible motivations. Managerialism will likely bend towards a limited charade of democracy. In the first place, it would seem that the managers, the ruling class of the new society, will, for their own purposes, require at least a limited democracy. The managerial economy cannot operate without a considerable degree of centralized planning. But in planning and coordinating the economic process, one of the factors that must be taken into account is the state of mind of the people, including something of their wants and their reactions to the work they are doing. Unless these are known, at least roughly, even reasonable efficiency in production is difficult. But totalitarian dictatorship makes it very hard, as Russia already proves, to get any information on the actual state of mind of the people. No one is free to give unbiased information, and the ruling group becomes more and more liable to miscalculate, with the risk of having the social machine break down. A certain measure of democracy makes it easier for the ruling class to get more and more accurate information. Secondly, experience shows that a certain measure of democracy is an excellent way to enable opponents and the masses to let off steam without endangering the foundations of the social fabric. Discontent and opposition, under an absolute dictatorship, having no mechanisms for orderly expression, tend to take terroristic and, in times of crisis, revolutionary forms. The example of capitalist parliaments shows how well democratic possibilities are able to make discontent and opposition harmless by providing them with an outlet. Faced with the threat of trouble from the submerged and underprivileged groups, and with the need for mediating conflicts within its own ranks, the new ruling class will doubtless prefer a controlled democracy rather than the risk of social downfall. This situation might be expected to cause a merging of the conflicts between capitalists and managers and a common front against the pressure of the masses. This has indeed often been the case. Nevertheless, the conflicts among the groups are real and cannot be eliminated even in the face of a common danger. In fact, the presence of the common danger itself is often a source of new conflicts. This follows because the groups, from the very status they occupy and functions they fulfill, favour different methods of meeting the danger and of maintaining privilege as against the masses. Even with managerial planning, there will be plenty of confusion. The rulers of managerial society do not really proceed scientifically any more than has any other ruling group. Their social aspirations are hidden by ideologies, not clarified by genuine social science. The ideologies mask what is happening, not only from men generally, but from the rulers themselves. When a process is not subjected to scientific control, there is no systematic means for the elimination of errors, no rational device for the resolution of conflicts. Errors may accumulate into disasters, and conflicts tend towards catastrophe. If you are still in any doubt, the following paragraphs should demonstrate how the Managerial Revolution provided the framework for the world depicted in Orwell's 1984. Nevertheless, it is extremely doubtful that the world political system of managerial society will be organized within the discernible future as a single world state. If we leave words and get closer to practical details, the organization of the entire world under a single sovereign state power seems to present difficulties that are close to insuperable. At the same time, the capitalist system of a comparatively large number of sovereign states cannot continue and is in fact collapsing right now. What is going to take its place? The answer, in general terms, is not obscure, and as with so many other questions, does not have to be given by idle speculation about the dim future. The working out of the answer started some time ago and is now going on quickly and before our eyes. The comparatively large number of sovereign nations under capitalism are being replaced by a comparatively small number of great nations, or superstates, which will divide the world among themselves. Some of the many nations which are eliminated, in fact, may be preserved in form. They will be kept as administrative subdivisions, but will be stripped of sovereignty. Sovereignty will be restricted to the few superstates. It might seem rash to try and predict just how many of these superstates there will be. Certainly, we cannot be sure just how long it will take to consolidate the world political system of managerial society, or just what stages will be gone through. Nevertheless, the main outlines and the sketch of the final result are already becoming clear. If we look at an economic map showing the occupations of mankind, a decisive fact is at once apparent. Advanced industry is concentrated in three, and only three, comparatively small areas: the United States, Europe, and the Japanese islands, together with parts of eastern China. It is advanced industry which makes the goods with which modern wars are fought and won, as well as the other key goods upon which modern culture depends. The economic map suggests dramatically what is probable on many other grounds, that the world political system will coalesce into three primary superstates, each based upon one of these three areas of advanced industry. This does not necessarily mean that these three superstates will be the United States, Germany, and Japan as we know them today. This may well be the case, but it need not be so. In these nations, there may be internal convulsions which, together with foreign military struggles, will seem to break their continuity with the past. New names may be used. This, however, would be of secondary importance in the long run. It should go without saying that the mechanism whereby this new political system will be built is and will be war. War is the only mechanism that has ever been employed for similar purposes in the past, and there is not the slightest indication, certainly not at the opening of 1941, that anything else is going to replace it. For Burnham, World War I was the last great war of the capitalist world, whereas World War II was the first great war of the managerial world. World War I had been fought using capitalist methods between capitalist powers. World War II still contained elements of capitalism, but the managerial elements had increased substantially. He saw the Second World War as subordinate to the Managerial Revolution that was progressing all over the world. Early 1941 was a bad time to be making predictions about the future course of geopolitics, and while there are many predictions Burnham made that were incorrect, what he was right about is more pertinent. The modern world makes a lot more sense when viewed through a managerial paradigm.
Though the pre-election period may have been demure and by past standards even dull, the thrilling end made it the election without precedent. With electoral expenses strictly limited by new laws, the campaign went off quietly. Redistribution cut up all but 92 constituencies, and the Prime Minister was among those forced to seek a new district. The Labour leader, who together with Mrs. Attlee also found time for a nationwide tour, asked West Walthamstow to return him to Parliament. Half an hour's bus ride away in Woodford, there was Mr. Churchill, likewise snapped, quizzed and filmed wherever he went, and likewise seeking the votes that would enable him to return to his place in the House of Commons.
Post-war Britain embraced managerialism wholeheartedly, nationalising many key industries, including electricity production, railways, coal mining, and oil and steel production. The new management would be efficient, operating on behalf of the people, and utilise cutting-edge technology in ways the outdated capitalists had proved incapable of. Managerialism made increasing gains in the West. In Europe through the European Coal and Steel Community, the EU in zygotic form, while in the United States, in 1971, the managers achieved their greatest victory over the capitalists via Nixon withdrawing the US dollar from the gold standard. The reason I consider this such a victory for the managers is that if you are a capitalist, your power comes from your capital. The move to fiat money meant the managers are able to print almost endlessly the currency that gives capitalists their power. Quite an advantage to have over your opponents.
An ordinary dinner party, the sort of occasion we all enjoy. The men are exchanging witty stories. And look at the women, aren't they pretty? Look at the way they laugh, they're delightful. But now the conversation turns to more serious matters.
I wonder if the government should return to the gold standard.
I think it should.
Good, then we're all agreed.
But oh dear, what's this? One of the women is about to embarrass us all.
I think the government should stay off the gold standard so that the pound can reach a level that will keep our exports competitive.
The lady has foolishly attempted to join the conversation with a wild and dangerous opinion of her own. What half-baked drivel! See how the men look at her with utter contempt.
Daphne, we're going home.
Women, know your limits. Now let's see the proper way.
Good. So we're all agreed. We should return to the gold standard.
Oh, I don't know anything about the gold standard, I'm afraid, but I do love little kittens. They're so soft and furry.
What a delightful thought, you dear, sweet, fragile little thing. I adore you. Women, know your limits. In thought, be plain and simple, and let your natural sweetness shine through.
But the managers did not have everything their own way. The Reagan-Thatcher period represented a considerable counter-assault by the capitalist elite, as both were committed to the rollback of the state. By the end of the 1970s, Britain's managerial dream was in ruins. Forced to borrow money from the IMF, rubbish uncollected during the winter of discontent, and nationalised industries that had proved themselves no more capable than their capitalist predecessors.
Oh, good heavens, what now?
Somebody must have pulled the communication cord.
Well, it wasn't me, matey. If British Rail want £50, they can just about blooming well go out and become a prostitute. Which they virtually are anyway, come to think of it. Right, commuters?
Dubbed the sick man of Europe, capitalist ideology was once again beginning to have mass appeal, and Thatcher was able to ride that wave to 3 consecutive election victories. Reagan's landslide electoral college victories in the US provide further evidence the tide was turning against managerialism in the West. Managerialism has proved itself surprisingly cumbersome and wasteful as an economic system, as the fate of some of the housing built by British managers shows. But perhaps the greatest blow to managerial philosophy was the collapse of the USSR. Despite this, managerial elites in the West continue unperturbed in their quest for a single global managerial system. It is becoming more obvious which organisations they operate through, as is the disdain they hold for the masses. Elite clubs where the price of membership is that you represent some large international organisation, you are not invited as an individual. Many of these institutions contend with parliaments for sovereignty and are constantly trying to expand their sphere of influence. So the struggle between capitalists and managers continues to this day. It seems as though with each Kondratiev wave, a new generation of industry titans are born, increasing capitalist manager tensions. It is hard not to see the actions of Elon dissolving the Twitter board as all-out capitalist versus manager warfare. Having some capital of my own and no desire to work for some soulless international organisation, I am inclined to support the capitalist in these duels. Because whatever you think of the likes of Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, right now, they're all we have.
The people spoke, the people won. It was a radiant eruption of democracy. But I think that was it, fellas. That sort of thing is not likely to happen again. Because at the bottom of all our terrified souls, we know that democracy is a dying giant, a sick, dying, decaying political concept writhing in its final pain. I don't mean that the United States is finished as a world power. The United States is the richest, the most powerful, the most advanced country in the world, light years ahead of any other country. And I don't mean the communists are going to take over the world, because the communists are deader than we are. What is finished is the idea that this great country is dedicated to the freedom and flourishing of every individual in it. It's the individual that's finished. It's the single solitary human being that's finished. It's every single one of you out there that's finished. Because this is no longer a nation of independent individuals. It's a nation of some 200-odd million transistorized, deodorized, whiter than white, steel-belted bodies, totally unnecessary as human beings and as replaceable as piston rods. Well, the time has come to say, is dehumanization such a bad word? Because good or bad, that's what is so. The whole world is becoming humanoid, creatures that look human but aren't. The whole world, not just us, we're just the most advanced country, so we're getting there first. The whole world's people are becoming mass-produced, programmed, numbered, insensate things.
It was a perfectly admissible argument that Howard Beale advanced in the days that followed. It was, however, also a very depressing one. Nobody particularly cared to hear his life was utterly valueless. By the end of the first week in June, the Howard Beale show had dropped 1 point in the ratings, and its trend of shares dipped under 48 for the first time since last November.